The sun didn't fall. It crushed the earth. It was the blinding, parched white light of high noon, a light that allowed no shadow a place to hide. The wind swept across the scorched grass, carrying the scent of red dust and melting resin. The expanse was so vast that sound was swallowed the moment it was born. It wasn't gunfire that stopped him. In this country, gunfire rolled across the ground like dry thunder, so familiar that men learned to walk through it as one walks through a sudden shower. What made his horse balk was the weeping. Not loud, not frantic, just a thin, fractured sound, drifting down from somewhere high above, as if the weeper had cried for so long she had forgotten how to shape a whole sound. Gideon Cross looked up by instinct, before he could stop himself. A solitary cottonwood stood amidst the sun-scorched grass. No shade, no fence, nothing to hide what was hanging there. A woman. She was strung up beyond her own reach, yet low enough that the toes of her boots were less than a span from the ground. Too high to die quickly, too low to climb down on her own. Someone had measured this distance with cruel precision. The rope bit tight around her wrists. The skin was taut, discolored, and abraded, blood seeping where the rough hemp sawed against bone. The rope was new. The pungent smell of fresh grass and fiber still clung to it, as if bought in town just this morning, specifically for this. Her dress was torn, not from falling, not from struggling, but torn to just enough. Enough for the sun to lash directly against skin pale from exhaustion. Enough for the wind to slip beneath the fabric, lifting it, then dropping it, reminding her and anyone passing by that here nothing was covered. The wind wasn't strong. It didn't need to be. A chill ran down Gideon's spine. Despite the sun hanging directly overhead, he had seen the dead, hanged, shot, left to desiccate in the desert. But this was different. She was alive, and that was intentional. The woman turned her head away when she realized she was being seen. The movement was so slight, it almost vanished into the air. But Gideon saw it. Her throat trembled. Her chest heaved as if every breath was a painful negotiation. Then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, so exhausted that the sound nearly shattered into pieces. "Don't look. Not save me, not please, just don't look." Gideon didn't answer immediately. He laid a hand on his horse's mane, steadying it. He knew this moment was irrevocable. One turn of the head, and everything would return to normal. The trail, the grassland, an afternoon passing without a trace. That was the rule of survival. That was how men lived long lives in this country. But he didn't turn away. He swept his gaze across the ground. No signs of a robbery. No scattered belongings. No blood on the dirt. No panic. The earth around the tree roots was trampled. Not the footprints of someone fleeing, but of those who had stayed, stood, watched, and waited. Someone had lingered here long enough to watch this play out. This was no accident. If it were an accident, they would have let her fall. If it were robbery, they would have taken what they wanted and vanished. But they left her there, alive, to be seen. Gideon dismounted, slowly, warily, as if any sudden movement might shatter something fragile holding this scene together. He walked toward the tree. The ground beneath his boots was hard, cracked. The woman flinched, shrinking back at the sound of footsteps. "Don't," she swallowed dryly, throat parched. "Don't make it worse." He looked up at the rope again. The knot was tidy, precise, not hurried, not sloppy. The man who tied it knew exactly what he was doing. Gideon drew his knife. The steel blade flashed a cold glint under the sun. She shut her eyes tight the moment she saw the metal. "No," she whispered. "Please." "Look away," Gideon said. His voice was deep, steady, unhurried. "If you can." She didn't answer, but she turned her face aside, just as she had at the start, hiding her humiliation in the endless void. Gideon cut the rope, very slowly. No sudden jerk, no letting her free fall. When the last strand snapped, he took her weight and lowered her to the ground, gently, as if setting down a piece of pottery overfired in the sun. She collapsed into the dust, clutching her wrists, trembling violently. For a long time, she didn't cry. She just breathed, gasping, brokenly, as if she had to relearn how to breathe from scratch. Gideon straightened up, sheathing his knife. He looked out at the desolate field once more. There was no one there, but he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that someone had been here, and that someone wanted to see what would happen next. They didn't leave her to die. They left her there, to see who was foolish enough to look. The wind had died. The heat of the high desert noon was no longer just a temperature. It had become a physical weight. The air was thick, shivering slightly over the cracked earth, blurring the horizon line. No birds, no whining insects, only the ragged, gasping breath of the woman sitting at the base of the tree and the blood thumping in his own temples. Gideon Cross was old enough to understand a simple truth that most young men refuse to learn. Trouble rarely hunts down those who intend to help. It hunts the witnesses. Anyone who survives long enough in this West learns the art of looking away. They hear a cry for help and keep walking. They see things they shouldn't see and tell themselves it's not their business. Not because they are cruel, but because they want to live. Gideon had lived long enough to know how effective that rule was, and long enough to know the cost of breaking it. He stood beneath the canopy of the cottonwood, knife still in hand, head held high, staring into the middle distance rather than at the woman he had just lowered to the ground. She sat there, her hands clasped tight around her own wrists, as if terrified that if she let go, they would dissolve into nothingness. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were glued to the patch of dirt right in front of her, where the sun burned so fiercely the air seemed to tremble in pain. A thought drifted through Gideon's mind. Slow. Smooth. Turn your back. The thought came easily, like an old habit. He could leave her some water. He could toss her a coat. He could point a finger toward town, mount up, and ride on, as if this afternoon had never existed. Out here, they called that wisdom. Survival in the West wasn't about who had the quicker draw. It was about knowing when to keep riding. Gideon knew that. He knew it in his bones. He scanned the field once more, empty, silent, motionless. But this silence didn't bring peace. It was a calculated silence, like an empty stage, the moment after the curtain falls. Someone was waiting to watch, not to see if the woman lived or died, but to see what he would do. Gideon lowered the knife. He heard her breathing, ragged, uneven. Every breath sounded like an apology for existing too long. "You don't have to." Her voice trembled, shattering in the dry air. "You don't have to stay." It wasn't a dismissal. It sounded like a warning. Gideon hunkered down. He placed his hat on the ground, directly in her line of sight. A small gesture. No touch, no force, just enough to let her know he was still there and he was real. "What's your name?" he asked. She was silent for a long time. The shadows of the tree seemed to swallow her whole. Then she spoke, softly, as if even a name was something that could be stripped away at any moment. "Ruth." Gideon nodded. He said nothing more. He set his canteen beside her, but didn't press it into her hands. He knew there were people, when pushed to the absolute brink, who couldn't bear the feeling of being touched, even if it was help. Ruth looked at the canteen, then up at him. Something flashed in her eyes, something like surprise, not because he helped, but because of how he helped. Gideon stood up and turned slightly away, deliberately giving her a private space. He looked up at the length of rope still dangling from the branch. The cut section lay on the ground, coiled and useless, like a dead snake. He knew. Seeing was only the first step. Taking action was what made turning back impossible. He had seen it, but not in the way they wanted. They wanted him to look and be afraid, to look and walk away, to look and understand that some things are best left to fate. But Gideon looked to memorize, to remember how the knot was tied, the height of the rope, the way the dress was torn, not in panic, but with cold control. He looked to understand that from this moment on, he had stepped into a story he didn't write. Ruth took a sip of water, then another. Her hands still shook violently, but her breathing had begun to slow. "You shouldn't have cut that rope," she said. There was no blame in her voice, just stark truth. Gideon turned back to look at her. His face was calm, still as a pond, but inside it was not. He felt it clearly. Something had just shifted, like the sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut behind him. "I know," he said. Ruth lowered her head. "They won't overlook this." "Likely not," Gideon replied, his voice gravelly, "but I don't intend to turn away." He didn't say he would protect her. He didn't promise to get her to safety. He didn't promise anything at all, because he knew, in this land, promises were often the quickest road to the grave. He simply stood there, present, holding his ground. And Ruth understood. She didn't look at him again, but this time, it wasn't out of shame. It was because she knew this was a man who understood exactly what he was walking into. And he was walking in anyway. The wind didn't quit. It only shifted, sweeping through the dry grass with a rasp, like the whisper of 1,000 unseen insects. The scent of dust rose up, mingling with the smell of cold sweat and stark desolation. It was a familiar scent, one you forget until it hits you. The smell of places where no one answers for a damn thing. Ruth didn't cry. Gideon only realized it after some time had passed, after the tremors in her hands had settled, after her breathing no longer hitched like someone dragged from the bottom of a river. She sat there, back pressed against the rough bark of the cottonwood, knees pulled tight to her chest. But there were no tears, only the trembling. It wasn't the shake of immediate fear. It was the reflex of a body that had endured too much for too long, until the nerves knew no other way to fire. She vibrated like an engine running on fumes. Gideon didn't push her. He'd learned that in moments like this, silence was the only thing that didn't inflict more damage. He stood there watching the wind bend the grass, feeling the weight of the sky pressing down on his shoulders. "Do you feel it?" Ruth asked, her voice light as chaff. Gideon looked up, Feel what? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the middle distance, unfocused, looking through the landscape to see something he couldn't. The watching, she said. It's still here. Gideon slowly scanned the field. It stretched out, vast and naked. No house, no shadow of a man, only the cracked dirt road cutting across it, leading toward the distant town like an old scar. There's no one here, he said. Ruth shook her head weakly. I know. That answer chilled Gideon's spine more than any gunshot ever had. The danger wasn't in the cottonwood tree anymore. The tree had done its job. The danger was in the space itself, in the excessive emptiness, in the fact that there was nowhere to hide from a gaze. Gideon understood. This wasn't a killing ground. This was a showroom. Where did they stand? He asked, his voice low. Ruth closed her eyes. I don't know, but I know they were there before you came. She took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly, as if shoring up her ribs for the words to come. They didn't leave me to die. The words dropped between them, heavy, needing no explanation. Gideon didn't ask who, he didn't ask why. The pieces were arranging themselves in his mind, and there are questions that, once voiced, make the nightmare too real. They strung me up, Ruth continued, her voice flat, even, as if telling a stranger's story. No one hurried, no one panicked. They checked the height, checked the knot. One even said, a little lower. She let out a short laugh. Dry. Not from humor, but because no other emotion fit. They said, if I died too fast, it would be a waste. Gideon clenched his jaw. He felt the anger rising, slow and sure, like water behind a dam. Not explosive rage, but the cold kind, the dangerous kind. What do they want? He asked. Ruth opened her eyes. For the first time, she looked straight at him. No pleading, no fear, just an exhaustion so deep it was almost transparent. They want me to remember who I am, she said, and they want everyone else to remember where I belong. She looked down at her hands. The rope burns were still there, bruised and swollen, as if the rope hadn't left. It had just turned invisible. They didn't do it to kill me, she said, biting off each word. They did it so I'd never dare stand up straight again. Gideon understood the humiliation, the breaking of the will, and above all, a test to see who was foolish enough to interfere, a trap that didn't need bait, just a witness. The wind picked up. The grass whispered nonsense. Gideon felt the eyes on him, though he still saw no one, like eyes accustomed to hiding just past the edge of the light. You shouldn't be here, Ruth said. Her voice didn't shake this time. They won't like it. Likely not, Gideon replied. He stood, dusting off his pants. The movement was calm, unhurried, unshowy, just a man standing up after a lunch break. He looked out at the field again, not searching, but ensuring that whoever was watching could see clearly. He wasn't playing the fool. But I am here, he said. Ruth didn't answer. She pulled the coat Gideon had left her tighter around her shoulders, not to hide, but to remind herself that this time, something placed on her shoulders wasn't part of someone else's cruel play. And somewhere out of sight, the trap clicked shut, one notch tighter. The sun began to dip, stretching shadows across the earth into distorted, twisted black streaks. Red dust coated the pant legs, the saddle, and the silence that wrapped around the two of them. Gideon didn't ask for permission. Not from the town, not from the church, and certainly not from the law. He hoisted Ruth onto the saddle, seating her in front of him, then turned the reins toward the ranch. He did it as naturally as if it were the only sensible thing left in the world. Out here, opening your mouth to ask for permission meant leaving a trail. And a trail is what they follow when they come back to kill you later. The ride home was submerged in silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of shared understanding. It was a heavy, viscous silence, shared between two people who knew that the story didn't end at that tree. Ruth sat with her back straight, too straight, as if, should she relax even a fraction, every breath would cause her body to crumble into pieces. Gideon didn't ask if she was in pain. He didn't ask where she wanted to go. He had made the choice for her, and that choice left no room for hesitation. Gideon's ranch lay low on the edge of the open country, where the wind wasn't broken by fences or tall buildings. A squat log house, a stable, and a patch of bare dirt yard wide enough for footsteps to echo clearly. Quiet. But the moment they crossed the fence line, Gideon knew something was wrong. Not because someone was there, but because everything was too orderly. No birds perched on the rail, no sound of horses shifting in the stalls. This silence wasn't rest. It was a held breath. Gideon helped Ruth down and guided her inside. He set a cup of water and some clean clothes within her reach. Then he turned his back, staring at the rough-hewn timber wall, as if that were the only thing keeping his thoughts from wandering too far. "You don't have to," Ruth started, her voice weak. "I need to," Gideon cut her off, his voice low and grinding. "Just be quiet for a moment." She understood, and she fell silent. Hoofbeats rang out in the yard right then. Not hurried, steady, familiar, like the sound of a man who had ridden this path 100 times. Gideon didn't turn around. He already knew who it was. "Gideon," the man called out, cheerful, a cheerfulness without cause. "You're back earlier than usual." Silas Harper, the neighbor to the west, 1.5 miles away, far enough not to know each other too well, but close enough to always see the chimney smoke from the other side. Silas rode into the yard, took off his hat, and grinned broadly. It was the kind of smile that never quite crossed the line, yet always made a man wonder what he'd missed. "Looks like your horse brought back some extra baggage," Silas said, his eyes sliding over the heaving mount. "I thought you were out trading." Gideon stepped out onto the porch, blocking the door. "Family business," Silas hummed, his gaze sliding past Gideon's shoulder, lingering on the closed wooden door behind him for just a beat. Too long to be normal. "Oh," he said. "So that's it." He didn't ask directly. Dangerous men rarely do. "Heard some screaming out in the fields around noon," Silas continued, his voice plastered with a thick layer of fake concern. "I was fixing to ride over and check, but then I thought, surely someone handled it already." Gideon looked him dead in the eye. "You thought right." Silas smiled. "Good. Neighbors ought to look out for each other around here." He turned his horse as if to leave, then paused, as if remembering something trivial, unimportant. "Oh," Silas said softly. "That girl. Is she all right?" Polite enough not to be rude, specific enough that it couldn't be an accident. Gideon didn't answer. Silas exhaled softly, shaking his head. "A shame. Things like that shouldn't happen to women." He put his hat back on, then dropped one last sentence, casual, almost absent-minded. "He knows who did it." No name was given, no emphasis was placed, but Ruth, standing inside the door, heard it as clearly as thunder. The door opened. She stepped out onto the porch. slow, steady. She looked straight at Silas for the first time. "You know," she said. Silas wasn't surprised. He just smirked, shrugging, as if hearing a harmless accusation from a child. "Know what?" he asked. Ruth didn't answer him. She turned to Gideon, her voice cold and sharp as a shard of pottery. "It's him," she said. No trembling, no hesitation. "He didn't do it, but he knows." In that instant, Gideon understood one thing with absolute clarity. From the moment he cut her down from that tree, he had stepped into the mire. But from this moment, when the accusation was spoken right on his porch, there was no retreat. Silas looked at Gideon. The smile on his lips didn't change, but his eyes brightened just a fraction, not with fear, but with satisfaction. "You best be careful, Gideon," he said lightly, "bringing strange trouble home. Sometimes folks forget who really owns this land." He turned his horse and rode away leisurely, slowly, without looking back. Gideon stood there long after the man's shadow had vanished. The wind blew through the porch, carrying the familiar scent of dust. The ranch remained quiet, but now Gideon knew this silence was waiting for the scent of blood. The town didn't open its doors to welcome them. It opened its eyes, heads lifted as hooves pounded the packed dirt of the main street. Conversations were severed mid-sentence, hanging in the air like blades waiting to drop. Nods of greeting were sharper than usual, hurried and evasive. Ruth felt the weight of it before Gideon did. She tugged her sleeves lower, fingers clawing into the rough fabric as if cloth could hide what happened yesterday. Gideon rode slow, very slow, not out of fear, but because he knew that galloping through town only makes people think you're running. In this country, the truth matters less than how the story is told, and this story had already begun to change its tune. "Is that her?" A whisper slithered through the dust. "Heard she was found strung up. Wonder if it's true." Gideon didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes fixed forward. He had lived long enough to understand. Stopping to explain yourself to a crowd only gives them more details to twist. The sheriff's office lay at the end of the main drag. Door open, unlocked. This place didn't need locks, because those who walked in rarely walked out with the same posture they had when they entered. Sheriff Dalton looked up as their shadows stretched across the floorboards. He didn't frown. He showed no annoyance, just the slow, measuring look of a man used to weighing trouble on a scale. The deputy leaned against the wall, hand resting idly near his gun belt. Not tense, but not loose either. "Morning," the sheriff said. His voice was flat. "You were early." "Just passing through," Gideon replied, his voice low. "Need a word?" The sheriff nodded, slowly. "About the girl." Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but the deputy raised a hand. Not roughly, not rudely, just enough to stop the sound, dead, in her throat. "We'll do the asking," the sheriff said calmly. "Follow procedure." Those two words dropped into the room, heavy as a coffin lid, closing soft and tight. The sheriff asked where Gideon found her, asked why she had no papers, asked why she was traveling alone through the Badlands. The questions came steady and clean. None sounded cruel, but each question laid another brick, building an invisible wall around them. "Vagrancy laws," the sheriff said, thumbing through yellowed pages of a thick ledger. "In place to protect the town." "Protect who?" Gideon asked. The sheriff looked him dead in the eye, his expression unchanging. Order. Ruth swallowed dryly. I'm not a vagrant. The deputy raised his hand again. This time, he stepped closer. You'll get your turn, he said. Later. The sheriff exhaled softly. We'll just hold her overnight, until things clear up. One night. In this land, one night was enough for a human being to vanish, and for no one to remember exactly why. Gideon understood it before Ruth did. He felt the trap closing, quiet, non-violent, and completely legal. No, he said. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. That ain't your call. The deputy stepped forward, just one step, and placed a hand on Gideon's shoulder. Not a shove, not a grip, just a touch, light enough that no one could call it an assault, but heavy enough to let Gideon know, if he stood still for 1 second longer, this story would no longer be his. He turned. He didn't strike back. He simply slid to the side, using the deputy's own weight to off-balance him by half a step. The room fell into a dead silence. Outside, someone laughed dryly, the sound of spit hitting dry dirt. The sheriff stood up. For the first time, his voice hardened like cold steel. You're making this worse. Gideon looked him in the eye. No, I'm just refusing to make it easy. He took Ruth's arm, not roughly, just firm enough for her to understand. Now, they walked out of the office. They didn't run. Running is an admission of guilt. Running lets them tell the story however they want. They mounted their horses, slowly, amidst a circle of eyes, memorizing every detail. Gideon knew that the moment hooves left the main street, the story would change its name. He would no longer be the man who cut the rope to save a life. He would be a kidnapper. Ruth would no longer be a victim. She would be something that needed to be detained for clarification. When the town had receded behind them, Ruth spoke, her voice thin, nearly swept away by the wind. They'll come after us. Gideon nodded, eyes on the horizon. Yeah. And you're taking me anyway? Yeah. She was silent for a long time. The hooves beat a steady rhythm on the road. Then she asked the final question. Not for an answer, but to confirm what she already knew. You know this won't end well, don't you? Gideon looked at the road, stretching out before them. Long, empty, and chosen. I know, he said, but if we stayed, they would have rewritten everything, and he was too old. Too old to live the rest of his life inside a story told by someone else's tongue. The sky above them was bleached bone white, without a single cloud, an aching, blinding whiteness that burned everything beneath it into ash and silence. The road ahead stretched straight, crawling over barren mounds like the spine of a giant beast long dead. They were not being pursued, at least not in the way Ruth had imagined in her nightmares. No thundering hooves behind them, no wild shouting echoing from the distance, no warning shots tearing through the air, only the wind and the steady, rhythmic breathing of two horses. This quiet lasted long enough to make a common man careless. But Gideon kept his horse at a measured pace, no faster than usual, but no slowing down to listen either. In this land, only the terrified run for their lives. The confident ones, they let the prey exhaust itself and turn back. Ruth sat straight in the saddle. This time, not from tension, but because something inside her, something that had been broken, was beginning to stand up on its own. "Do you ever wonder," she said after a long silence, her voice small in the vast expanse, "why they didn't kill me?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. His eyes were glued to the roadside grass, flattened into lines too neat to be accidental. "Because death has no utility," he said, his voice low and cold. "The dead don't carry anything." Ruth nodded. "My brother did." She told the story calmly, without emotion, as if reading aloud a shipping manifest she had memorized. Her brother worked along the railroad. No title, no power, just a petty clerk. But he worked with numbers. And there were numbers that didn't fit. Shipments with no recipients. Money vanishing into the void, then returning in different, cleaner clothes. He started writing it down, Ruth said, not because he was brave, but because he was afraid he'd forget. She spoke of scraps of paper hidden in coat linings, of names reduced to meaningless initials, of figures that explained nothing yet, told everything. And about the day her brother never came back from his shift. "They said he ran off," she said, her voice light. "But I knew better. Men who run off never leave the numbers behind." Gideon listened. Disparate pieces began to click together, forming a shape that was sharp and cruel. This wasn't a story about a woman strung up on a tree for a personal vendetta. She was just the exposed edge of something that had been rotting for a long time, buried deep beneath this earth. The wind shifted. Suddenly, Gideon raised a hand, signaling a halt. No rush, no panic. He dismounted, crouched low, and touched his fingers to the dusty earth. Fresh hoofprints, shallow and few. Not the tracks of gunmen in a hurry, but of men who were sure. "We're not being robbed," he said softly, eyes still on the ground. Ruth swallowed dryly. "I know. The first shot wasn't aimed at them. It dug straight into the dirt in front of the horse's nose, close enough to kick up a cloud of dust, but far enough to harm no one. The message was clear. Stop." 3 gunmen peeled away from the hillside. Spread out in a line, wide, unmasked. They had no need to hide their identities. Gideon stood tall. He didn't draw immediately. He saw how they rode, not the wild, reckless style of highwaymen, but the neat precision of men trained together. "Hand her over," one of them spoke up. His voice was calm, devoid of hatred, as if he were just here to correct a shipping error. "She's not property," Gideon said. The man offered a thin smile. "On paper she is." Ruth watched them. Her gaze settled on the rider in the back. Sunlight glinted off something metal pinned to his chest. A badge, not new, not shiny. It was tarnished, scratched, but clear enough to leave no room for doubt. The shock didn't make her scream. It made her understand. "So that's it," she said, her voice almost relieved. "It's not the law chasing me, it's the thing hiding behind the name." The man with the badge didn't deny it. He simply spurred his horse one step closer. "You're carrying something that doesn't belong to you." Ruth let out a short, dry laugh. "So was my brother." No one answered that. Gideon raised his gun. He didn't aim. He just showed them he had picked a side. He knew exactly what that meant. From the moment he placed himself between their barrels and the girl, he stood on the wrong side of the law. And when the law stands in the wrong, the man standing in the right is the one they call a criminal. The second shot rang out, closer, tearing the air by his ear. No more doubt, no more detours. The truth had grown bigger than one woman's life. And now it demanded blood, not to prove it was right, but to silence those bold enough to look it in the eye. They arrived when the sky was still the color of cold ash. This was a place where the law was considered real. Not a big town, no welcome sign, just a sheriff's station standing stark at the crossroads, where every road was forced to pass if it wanted to call itself legitimate. The wind here didn't blow. It hissed through the window cracks, carrying the scent of old paper and dry ink. Sheriff Kane didn't stand when they walked in. He sat behind a rough, hewn wooden desk, eyes deep set and cloudy as the dregs of cold coffee. He looked at Gideon first, then at Ruth. The look lasted, heavy, as if weighing a stone just placed upon his shoulder. "You bring trouble here," he said, his voice raspy. Then his gaze snapped back to Gideon, cold and sharp. "And by bringing her, you bring it along with yourself." Gideon didn't argue. He hadn't come for permission. He stood there, road dust coating his shoulders, feeling the fatigue deep in his marrow, but his head remained high. "We don't need safety," Gideon said, his voice low but resonating in the cramped room. "Just a place where people aren't strung up in broad daylight." Sheriff Kane let out a short, soft laugh. Not mocking, just tired, the fatigue of a man who had seen too many sunrises without seeing justice. "I don't promise safety," he said, tapping a finger on the desk. "I don't promise a happy ending." He leaned back, the wood creaking under his weight. "The law promises only one thing. If you stand before it, it looks back at you." Ruth took a step forward. She didn't hide behind anyone. She didn't cast her eyes to the floor. Her shadows stretched long across the floorboards, sharp and unmoving. "I'm not running anymore," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the room's silence like a razor. "And I don't want to be hidden." The room fell into stillness. Sheriff Kane watched her. He looked at her like a man assessing something that couldn't be measured by standard rulers. "Do you understand?" he said slowly, word by word. "If you show yourself, they will show themselves too." He paused, letting the warning soak into the air, not to apologize, but to control the story. Ruth nodded. "Then, let them see me first." The plan was uncomplicated, and for that very reason, it was lethally dangerous. No dark alleys to hide in, no waiting for nightfall, no escape route. Daylight. The town square. At the hour when everyone was awake. Sheriff Kane sent a telegram. No names mentioned. Just the naked truth. "A woman wants to speak." That was enough. When Ruth walked out into the square, the sun was high. The light wasn't harsh, but it was brilliant. Bright enough that no shadow could hide a face. Some recognized her, some turned away, feigning busyness, some not out of bravery but curiosity, the cruel curiosity of the mob. Gideon stood 3 paces behind her, not shielding, not leading. This moment was no longer his. He was just a shadow of the past, standing guard for the present. The whispers started up like a hive of disturbed bees, then suddenly died out, because Ruth stood tall, unbound, not hanging, not pushed forward as a warning. She stood there as someone who had chosen, on her own, to be seen. One man stepped out of the crowd, then 2, then 3, clean coats, untouched by road dust, careful, polite voices, eyes used to looking at others without ever being scrutinized in return. A badge flashed in the sun. No one raised a voice, no one drew a gun, and that was exactly what convicted them. Sheriff Kane stepped forward, not to accuse, but to open the stage. "Miss Ruth," he said, his voice echoing across the silent square. "Do you have anything you wish to say before these witnesses?" Ruth took a deep breath. The morning air filled her lungs, cold and sharp. In that moment, Gideon understood. This woman wasn't standing here to be saved. She was standing here to redirect the gaze. "If they want to look at me," she said, her voice steady without a single tremor, "then it is because I am standing." And she told it. No tears, no pleas for pity, only the things that had been hidden in the dark. Names, numbers, dates, routes, signatures, scattered pieces that, standing alone, convicted no one. But when placed side by side under the sunlight, no one could stand still anymore. Some men stepped back. Some looked down at their polished boots. Some opened their mouths to speak, then stopped. No shots were fired, because bullets become useless when light floods every corner. Men don't fall because they are shot. They fall when they are forced to stand still, right before the eyes of others, and reveal their true nature. When the sun reached its zenith, Sheriff Kane stepped forward. Just one step. "The law will take it from here," he said. No promise of justice, only a promise of procedure, but this time a procedure that wouldn't be bent. Dawn was long gone, but the light remained, harsh and scrutinizing. Ruth turned and walked away. She didn't look back at the square. She didn't seek Gideon's eyes. She knew she had left behind what needed to be left. Gideon followed. He didn't ask about the future. He didn't promise a long road. They walked in the same direction, without looking back. The West never promises peace, but this time it no longer dared to hang a human being high.